Happy Thanksgiving. Today we're making classic pumpkin pie. I'll walk you through the steps to make your crust from scratch, make the filling, and even add a little extra flourish. Let's get baking. So the first step in making our pumpkin pie will be to make the pie crust. Sometimes making pie crust from scratch is a bit intimidating for cooks, but it's really no big deal. We'll walk through it together. So we're going to start with flour. As always, ingredients, measurements, and instructions are in the description. That's grams. Zero out our scale. And to the bowl, I'm going to add 3 cups of flour. That's about 360 grams. To that, we'll add half a teaspoon of salt. I use kosher salt, table salt, okay. Of course, it's just that little bit saltier. And we're going to give that a quick stir with our pastry blender. You can use a pastry blender, you can use a food processor. There are techniques where folks just slice the butter or shortening the fat that they're going to use very thin and quickly mix it with their hands. Any of those are okay. You just want to have a light touch when you're mixing something like pie dough because that'll keep it nice and flaky. All right, so stirred in our salt. And now we're going to add our fat, and I'll use 10 tablespoons of butter, unsalted butter, and 6 tablespoons of shortening. So I've already cut the butter into smaller pieces. The shortening breaks up a little bit more easily, so I just have it cut into 4 larger pieces. And it's always a good idea to keep things cold when you're making pie crust. Cold is your friend. Whenever it starts to be difficult to work with, put everything you're working with back in the refrigerator or even the freezer briefly. So there are techniques where people freeze butter and grate it in. Any of that works. All right, but what we're going to do is add this fat into our bowl. And my butter's already in fairly small cubes, so I've got a head start here. And we are going toss that with the fork a little bit so we get some of those bits coated in flour. We'll add the rest in. Now, some of it doesn't want to go. Dump. There we go. And we're going to start working that in with the pastry blender until we have a mixture that is not completely uniform, but we want the largest bits of butter or shortening to be about the size of a pea. Some bits will be smaller. You can do this in a food processor if you want. Again, you're just going to kind of blitz it real quickly and check to make sure you don't overmix. All right, so we're going to mix this, and when our mixture is looking good, I'm going to show you how that looks, and we'll add water, and that's all that we're going to put in here. All right, so now that we've got all of our butter and shortening cut into our mixture, you can see there are bits of flour, bits of butter and shortening that are about pea size, and the rest are somewhere smaller. And these little bits of fat are going to become the flaky layers in that pie crust. So the flakier you want your pie crust to be, the more carefully you're going to want to mix this. And that's also why the cold is helpful, because if your fat gets too warm, it'll just kind of melt in as you're mixing. So if you do have a really warm kitchen, if it's a warm day, you might even want to put this whole bowl in the refrigerator partway through mixing and then pull it back out and keep going. All right, so we're gonna set our pastry blender aside, and it's time to add the water. I've got half cup of ice water. Usually when I get started, I take cold water and I put an ice cube in it. And by the time I've got everything mixed, that ice cube has just melted in. So I've got nice cold water. I'm going to take my flour and butter mixture here, and I'm going to kind of slide some of that off to the side of the bowl. All right. And the reason I'll do that is that I'm going to add the water gradually so that it just moistens the pie crust. You want to add as little water as you can get away with. So I'm not going to overmix either. I'm just going to take the fork and kind of flick that top layer of flour into the center. We're going to add a little bit more water. And of course, if you're doing this with a food processor, you'll want to add the water maybe in a couple of goes, you know, some water, quick blitz with the food processor, and then again. All right, so I'm going to add the rest of my water. If you're in a particularly humid place, if it's a rainy day, you might actually find you need a little less. If it's very dry, you might find you need more. Usually that half cup does exactly what I need it to do. We can always add more. The risk there is that just that you'll have a slightly tougher pie crust. But if that's the difference between having something you can work with and not, go ahead and add a little more water. It's still a delicious homemade pie crust. No one is going to complain. All right, so I'll add my last tiny bit of water here. Set that aside just in case I wind up needing more. All right, and you can see this doesn't exactly look like a dough yet. The clumps are bigger, but not holding all the way together. That's okay. We want this to be as barely held together as possible, so we're going to get there. All right, so at this point, I'm actually going to get 2 pieces of plastic wrap out, one perhaps a little larger than the other, and I'm going to put this on the counter. And I'm going to take this pie dough and I'm going to put part of it on one and part of it on the other, and kind of, well, I'll pull this together in the bowl a little bit first. Okay, and you see if I just add a little bit of pressure with my hands, I'm going to get something that's almost holding together. That's good. I'll turn it just a little bit more. You really don't want to work this too much. All right, so kind of got it pulled together in a dough, and I'm going to take slightly uneven pieces here. So of course, pumpkin pie is a 1 crust pie. I like to give myself lots of room for error, so I've made enough for a double crust. I'm going to take a smaller chunk of dough, all right, and put it on the smaller piece of plastic wrap. That's going to be extra for pie crust snails. We'll do those at the end. And the other larger piece, make sure that holds together reasonably well. I'm going to take that one, and that's going to go on this bigger piece of plastic wrap. And don't worry if there are really little crumbly bits. All right, just set those in the center, work them in a little bit. All right, same with the other one. All right, and that's going to give me plenty of dough for my bottom crust, and the extra bits that we trim we'll put with the pie crust snails. All right, so just kind of pull that together so it's just a rough disc. I'll do the other one just off the camera. All right, we're going to wrap that up and we're going to refrigerate it for about 30 minutes. You can definitely put it in there for longer. You can leave it in there for a day or so, or in the freezer for longer. And if you are running a little short on time, you can cheat a bit by putting that in the freezer for like 10-15 minutes, just to get it chilled down enough to roll out without getting too warm, and also just to let that gluten start to develop so that you have a pie crust that's going to hold together. Now that my larger disc of pie crust has chilled for a bit, I'm going to go ahead and roll it out. So to do that, I've put a bit of plastic wrap on the counter. This is just going to make things easier when I transfer my pie crust to the pie plate. I'm going to sprinkle that with flour. We don't want to use too much, but you're going to need some. Too much flour can make this tough. But what's even more tough is your pie crust being completely stuck to your kitchen counter. So little flour isn't going to hurt. I'm just gonna, you'll notice that that's just to see how that looks. We can still see bits of butter in there. That's fine, that's good. That's going to make for flaky pie crust. All right, so we're gonna sprinkle a little bit of flour on the top as well. I'm gonna go ahead and use the plastic wrap that was in on top. And we're going to give that a roll. Don't worry if you get a few cracks. We can always repair those. Remember, we have a pretty large piece of dough to work with, so if it gets really crumbly at the edges, it's okay. We've got a little bit of running room there. All right, so you see I gave it a couple rolls and I turned it about a quarter turn. We'll repeat that process. That helps it not to stick, and it helps us to roll that evenly. All right, if you do feel like it's starting to stick, you can gently pick that up, get a little more flour underneath, or even flip it over, and then keep going. All right, so I did wind up getting my bench scraper out to help slide my pie crust a little bit as I was rolling it. It is big enough to fill my pie plate. So now is the step where it could all go wrong, but it should be fine. We're gonna transfer this pie crust into the pie plate. People have different methods for doing this. Some folks fold it in quarters and unfold it. I think mine is so flaky that might not work out. So instead, what I'm going to do, some folks will roll it onto the rolling pin and kind of roll it out onto the pie plate. All right, we're just gonna kind of slide my hand underneath this plastic to make sure I don't have any bits that are really gonna be stuck. All right, I'm gonna take this top layer off. All right, and we're just gonna slide our pie plate over here. I'm gonna flip it onto the top of the pie crust and flip over. All right, and there we go. We have our pie crust in our pie plate, yay. All in one piece, a minor miracle when you've got nice flaky pie crust. And you know what, if it doesn't go all in one piece, you can patch it up, it's no big deal. All right, so now we're gonna kind of adjust a little bit. I'm a little off center. So if you think you can get away with shifting your pie crust if you're off center, do that. The other thing we can do is take some of the overhang. We're gonna use our glue here, a little bit of water. All right, just dab the edges here. All right, and just kind of pinch some of that onto that extra. There's places where you've got extra. All right, unless you rolled your pie crust into a perfect circle, and I never do, you're gonna have more in some spots than others. All right, so we're just gonna go ahead and add that there, like so. Where else have we got some extra? No pie crust goes to waste. And we're gonna wind up pinching this edge anyway, so so this is all gonna get, that's all going to work out just fine. All right, so put a little bit more here. We'll continue like that for a moment. All right, and now that I have pretty reasonable coverage around the top lip of my pie plate, I'm just gonna go around and pinch that. If it gets a little bit sticky at all, I can just dip my fingers in flour. All right, so that we have kind of a raised edge forming. All right. Some spots I might have to roll. There might be places where I'm still a little short or I have a little bit too much, and I can just even out as I go along. All right, and kind of roll that over and pinch a little bit. We want to work pretty quickly because, again, we don't want our pie crust to get melty. But this will get chilled down again before we bake it. All right, so I have a raised edge all the way around. I could leave it like that, but I'm gonna go ahead and kind of make that little wavy pattern we often see with pie crust. And I'm just gonna kind of take 2 fingers on my left hand and a knuckle, index knuckle on the right, and work my way around. And this doesn't have to be perfect. Again, if things get a little bit sticky, you can just get a little flour going on your fingers, but move quickly around the edge. Like so. And we will be par baking this pie crust. It means we're going to bake it part way on its own before we put that pumpkin pie filling in. So since we're going to do that, here's our, by the way, there's the edge of our crust. Ta-da! All right, so since we're going to par bake it, we do want to dock it. That means we're going to just kind of make some little fork imprints. I like to go around the side a little bit and do that too. And what that's going to do is help keep our pie crust from like puffing up when we bake this unfilled. All right, there's a couple other things we're going to do to make sure that we don't have trouble as well. All right, the next one is that we're going to line this with foil. Before we line it with foil, I'm going to butter the foil so that it doesn't stick to the pie crust. Go, buttered our foil. I'm just gonna place that in our pie crust. Kind of careful not to deform our nice crinkled edges. And now it's ready for another 20 or 30 minutes in the refrigerator. Or at this point, you can stop again, stick it in the freezer, and especially if you wrap your edges carefully so that they don't dry out too much, you can keep that pie crust in the freezer for quite a while before you're ready to bake. All right, so this is definitely a potential do-ahead step if you're planning, of course, your big Thanksgiving meal, or you just want to get a jump on making a pie. All right, we're gonna put this in the refrigerator and we'll come back again to bake it when when it is nice and chilled. So our pie crust has chilled. It is lined with that buttered foil, and now it's time to bake it. We've preheated our oven to 450 degrees. We are just going to add to this pie plate some pie weights. Again, we don't want our crust to puff up and deform or slide around the pan while we're baking. You want to fill up your pie shell with pie weights. You can use, there are ceramic pie beads or good old-fashioned dried beans, and you can reuse these dried beans over and over and over again. I don't know how many pies these beans have helped me with, but I've got some, I don't know, some pinto beans and some lentils, it appears. In they go. Spread those around without actually getting them onto my pie shell. There we go. Ta-da, we're ready for the oven. We're gonna bake this for 15 to 20 minutes until the crust is, the edge of the crust is just very lightly browned. The bottom of the pie crust may still be translucent, that's fine, but we're gonna go ahead and pop it in the oven. All right, our pie crust is out of the oven. It took just about 15 minutes, and as you can see, the edges of the crust are just lightly golden. We are going to let that cool for a bit and then carefully remove the pie weights, our beans here, let it cool completely before we move on to fill it with pumpkin pie filling. Now that our crust has fully cooled, you can see it's still a little translucent, not browned at all at the bottom, but just slightly browned at the edges. We are ready to make our pie filling. We're going to start with 2 eggs. To which we'll add 1 can of pumpkin pie. Calls for pumpkin. You can, of course, roast your own pumpkin. That's delightful. Even butternut squash will work, but we're going with the good old-fashioned can of pumpkin here. Make sure we get all the pumpkin out of there. And we're just going to mix that together until it's thoroughly incorporated. The egg yolks, there's no trace of egg yolk in there or anything like that. Thoroughly mixed, no streaks of egg yolk in there. Of course, you can use a stand mixer if you want. You can use a whisk if you'd like. It'll get the job done. My mom used her hand mixer, so do I. All right, now we're going to put a cup of brown sugar. This is dark brown sugar. That amounts to just a bit over 200 grams. We will add to that a tablespoon of pumpkin pie spice. Don't be shy with your pumpkin pie spice. A tablespoon of flour. And a half a teaspoon of salt. Again, I use kosher salt. You can use table salt. I might do a scant half teaspoon if you're doing table salt. All right, so we're going to make sure that all of this gets thoroughly mixed in. In fact, I'm just going to, on top of that brown sugar, just sort of get the spices or seasonings and that flour a little bit started. All right, we're gonna mix again, and once that is thoroughly blended, we will add our last ingredient, which will be the traditional evaporated milk. All right, our seasonings, our sweetener, all blended into our pumpkin pie mixture. And we're going to add our evaporated milk. Normally I would use the can of evaporated milk, which is 1 2/3 cups. Here since some of my family members are lactose intolerant, I'm using lactose-free milk. That I used lactose-free whole milk, and I just took 4 cups of that and slowly cooked it down on the stove until I had evaporated it down to the 1 2/3 cups. And basically all evaporated milk is milk that has had 60% of its water content heated away. So it's a DIY, it's easy, it's slightly time consuming, but if you're already in the kitchen, it's no big deal. So I'm gonna go ahead and use that. Do what works for you. I'm gonna pour some of that in. mix, and then pour the rest in. All right, we have our pumpkin custard mixture. Just gonna take a spatula, run it around the edge, and make sure that there aren't any streaks of unincorporated milk or pumpkin in there. It all looks good. It'll look about like that. So we are going to pour that into our par-baked pie shell and slide it into a 325-degree oven, which is already preheated. There will be one other step we take though as we do that. All right. So our custard into our pie pan, aligned with our par-baked shell. Right, and now the shell will finish, the pie crust will finish baking. The custard will bake, but these exposed edges of our pie will get too brown if it all sits in the oven uncovered. So what I'll do is shield those edges with some foil. There are, if you have a pie crust shield, use that, of course. Some recipes tell you to put foil around the edges after the pie is about halfway through baking. I find that a lot more difficult than putting the foil around the edges before you put the pie into the oven. So I have strips of foil. It always takes me 4 strips to do this. It's like 3.5, but it works. And I've just crimped those together. And I'm going to wrap those around the edge of my pie. This will be a little crinkly. We'll get this done. This doesn't have to be a particularly tight fit or anything. The idea is just to protect the edge of the pie crust from over browning before the custard gets cooked all the way. And what we're going to do is bake this in that 325-degree oven for 50 to 55 minutes. We want our pie crust, or rather our pie filling, to set but not to crack. We can test it with the tip of a knife, although that will cause it to crack, which is no big deal. That's just cosmetic. But another good way to tell if our pie filling is done is going to be to see if we basically give the pie a little jiggle, and if it's still significantly wiggly in the middle, it needs to cook a little bit longer. But if it doesn't really move, then it's going to be set, and carryover cooking is going to happen, which means that when we take it out of the oven, it is going to finish setting up as it sits there and cools. So if we don't want to overcook it, which is fine, totally edible, still tasty, but not quite as smooth, then we want to wait until it's just firm, and that'll be the time to take it out. I will take this foil off of the edge of the pie crust carefully about halfway through baking. So it has been an hour or so, and we are ready to take our pumpkin pie out of the oven. I checked it at 50 and then 55 minutes, and it just wasn't quite there. I'm going to show you what it looks like when it is. So here we go. Take our pie out of the oven. And if you can see here, hold it up a little bit. See how the pie just has a slight jiggle in the center, but it is otherwise set. That is a pumpkin pie that's done. We don't need to stick anything in it to cause a crack, anything like that. We might still get just a bit of a crack around here, but that custard will continue to set up as it cools. So we're gonna let that pie cool. And the toughest part of the whole thing, we don't get to crack into it until it is completely cool, which, given the time of day today, is going to be the next day. And I do usually bake my pumpkin pies the night before Thanksgiving. So we have our finished pumpkin pie here. It has cooled overnight, and we have got our first slice. We're going to tuck into that. We've added a little bit of whipped topping, and just to gild the lily, here are a couple of our pie crust snails. Let's take a bite. Perfect. From our house to yours, we hope you have a happy Thanksgiving. Check back every Friday for a new recipe.